another speaker that is here very shortly. And it's a very special speaker, it's a very special voice. It's a very important voice that we have. And I'm sure, I am 100% sure that all of you recognize him. You've probably seen a lot of videos on Facebook, on YouTube, from the tremendous important work that he does and his organization does at the United Nations Human Rights Council. I want to be so honored to welcome the director, the executive director of the UN WASH in Geneva. Please give a warm welcome for Hillel Neuer.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Saskia, and congratulations on organizing this wonderful event. It's truly a pleasure for me to be here in this beautiful country of Sweden, in this wonderful city of Stockholm, and to be with this remarkable group of people who've come from near and far to show their support for the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. Raoul Wallenberg has been called the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century. During the darkest days of the Holocaust, Raoul Wallenberg was a beacon of light. As a Swedish diplomat in Budapest, over 6 months in 1944, Raoul Wallenberg rescued 100,000 Jews. He showed that one person with the courage to care and the commitment to act can confront evil and transform history. Today, on Sweden's National Raoul Wallenberg Day, it is a great honor for me to be addressing you here in Stockholm, in Raoul Wallenberg Square, together with representatives of the Swedish Parliament. Today here in Sweden and around the world, all of us should take the opportunity to reflect upon and learn from the heroism of this great humanitarian. Raoul Wallenberg was a diplomat representing a neutral country in time of war. But what his example tells us is that humanity is more important than neutrality. As the great late Elie Wiesel said, quote, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation, we must never be silent. Each one of us has a duty to intervene." When Raoul Wallenberg acted and other heroes like Karl Lutz of Switzerland, they were very much, sadly, they were very much alone. The great powers, yes, they fought the Nazis, but none intervened to stop the Holocaust. None intervened to bomb the tracks. As Chief Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau of Israel recently said, and I heard him recently in Tel Aviv, he said if they would have bombed the tracks, the planes that were in the area, just go a little bit off where they were going on a bombing raid anyway, would have bombed the tracks, they would have saved in one day tens and tens of thousands of Jews, but none did it. None did it. If the state of Israel existed then, it would have been an entirely different story. And Rabbi Lau mentioned that he'll never forget in July of 1976 when anti-Semitic terrorists hijacked planes and that were coming from Israel and brought them to Entebbe, Uganda. Some of you here are old enough to remember the Entebbe terrorist hijacking. And they brought the planes and divided the Jews and the non-Jews. And Israel, in a miraculous raid, which was headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu's brother, Yoni Netanyahu, they managed to rescue virtually all of the Jews except for one or two. And they rescue the people who were taken by these anti-Semitic terrorists. And that's what the State of Israel did for Jews in danger in 1976, and which it continues to do today, and if only it had existed then. And that's why we're here today to celebrate the miracle of Israel. We're here today to celebrate the miracle of Israel, and we meet at a special time. We meet at a time of 3 significant historical anniversaries. This week, 120 years ago, Theodor Herzl convened in Basel, Switzerland, in August of 1897, 120 years ago, the first Zionist Congress. For the first time in 2 millennia, the Jewish people were gathered in plenary assembly. Once again, a live entity on the international scene as a political body. And after that miraculous gathering, Theodor Herzl noted in his diary famous words, and he said, and I quote, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I were to say this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. But perhaps in 5 years, certainly," didn't say perhaps, but he said, "perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it." He said this in 1897. And that's the anniversary we mark this week, but very soon in November, in 2 months, we will mark on November 2nd, the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. And that is the historic moment in November 2nd, 1917, when the British government, not alone, but with the consent of the great powers of the day, of the United States, of France, of Russia, and others. This was the equivalent of a UN Security Council resolution. If that existed at that time, this was the equivalent. Decided the following, the famous words, quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object." Indeed, Herzl, only 20 years prior, in the Zionist Congress, had determined in their program that their mission was to establish in public law to recognize the Jewish home, the Jewish homeland in public land, in public law. And this only 20 years later was recognized in what I say was the equivalent of the UN Security Council in 1917. It was an extraordinary moment. And only a few years later, when the League of Nations was created in Geneva, Switzerland, where I live, which today houses the UN Human Rights Council, and we'll talk about that in a moment, the League of Nations mandate enshrined the Balfour Declaration and elaborated, quote, "Whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country." And so, very soon, in 2 months, we will mark the 100th anniversary since the world recognized the historic indigenous rights of the Jewish people, indigenous people to the land of Israel. And then later that month, on November 29th, we'll mark the 70th anniversary since the United Nations voted on 29 November 1947 for the partition plan, deciding to recognize, to approve, to endorse the plan for 2 states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And as you know, that night, the Jews in Palestine danced on the streets with tears of joy, and the Arabs began the war. And they launched the war, and as the UN Secretary General remarked at the time, the Arabs made war against the United Nations, the Arab states. Now, we're here today to celebrate these 3 anniversaries. 120 years since the first Zionist Congress and Theodor Herzl, 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, 70 years since the recognition at the United Nations of a Jewish state. And you know, by the way, today it's controversial. Abbas is not sure if he will recognize Jewish state. He doesn't want to recognize a Jewish state. He might recognize Israel, but not a Jewish state. In the UN resolution of 1947, the words Jewish state appear 30 times. Counted, 30 times, Jewish state. This is not controversial. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to celebrate these historic anniversaries, and yet too often it seems that the world which recognized the rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel in 1917, in 1922, in 1947, when Israel was admitted as a member state in 1949, and yet it seems too often at the United Nations, where I have been living for the past 13 years across the street from the United Nations Human Rights Council, too often it seems that these basic rights are being called into question. are being called into question. And let me give you just a few examples. The United Nations' highest human rights body, the Human Rights Council, will meet in 2 weeks in Geneva, and I will be there. And they will meet and they'll have an agenda that will mark their proceedings, as every meeting that they have 3 times a year follows the same agenda. And we will meet on the week of September the 18th, and we'll have agenda item 4, which will be human rights issues around the world that require attention. And there we will address 193 countries. In theory, you could address 193 countries in the world that have human rights issues. You could. And then the next week, on Monday, 25 September, we'll have agenda item 7, which is human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. In other words, one agenda item for the entire world and one agenda item for Israel alone. Friends, no other country in the world has its own agenda item. Not North Korea, not Syria, not Sudan, where the leader is wanted for genocide. No country, only the Jewish state is singled out and targeted for its own special day, its own special agenda item. And democracies have spoken out. Ban Ki-moon 10 years ago spoke out, and yet it remains as a stain on the world's highest human rights body, which is supposedly committed in its founding charter to equality, to non-selectivity, to universality, and yet the stain of discrimination remains. And when we meet under agenda item 7, targeting Israel, what do they do in this agenda item? Well, they enact resolutions on Israel. Indeed, if you count, as we have counted in the past 11 years or so since the Council was created in June 2006, we counted that the Council has adopted 7 resolutions on Iran, 10 resolutions on North Korea, 21 resolutions on Syria, and 73 resolutions on Israel. 10 times more resolutions on Israel than on the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is helping Syria commit genocide, which tortures its own people in Evin prison, which requires every woman from the age of 7 to forcibly wear a hijab and cover her hair, denies women's rights. 10 times more on Israel than on Iran. And who are the members of this body? Well, you would not be surprised that China, one of the world's most oppressive states, 1.3 billion people denied freedoms, is a regular member of the UN Human Rights Council. Cuba, a police state where the artist El Sexto, whom we honored recently in Geneva at our Geneva Summit for Human Rights, and you're all invited to come in February 2018. Go to genevasummit.org, where we bring the real victims of human rights. And we brought Danilo Maldonado, who was thrown into prison because he's an artist, and he dared to criticize the communist regime of Cuba, and they threw him in prison. And he again, when he was free, he spoke out again, and he painted freedom, and they threw him in prison again. And he got out. And Cuba is a member of the Human Rights Council. Venezuela, a country that has taken its opposition leaders, Leopoldo Lopez, and the mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma, and we honored both of them and had their family members come to Geneva to receive our Courage Award. They've been thrown into prison. They're now under house arrest, harassed in ways that are horrific against their family. The opposition is thrown in jail. People don't have food to eat because of the failed communist policies of the Venezuelan regime. And basic human rights are trampled. People are tortured. 130 people have been killed in the past few months. The situation is a catastrophe. Venezuela is a member of the Human Rights Council. There's never been one resolution on Venezuela, never one resolution on Cuba, never one on China, never one on Saudi Arabia. That's the Human Rights Council. And so we're not surprised that this body singles out the Jewish state time and again. And by the way, it's not just the numbers. In the resolutions on Sudan, when they adopt some, they are diplomatic. They commend Sudan. They praise them for allowing in a UN expert. Only the resolutions on Israel are devoid of any positive language, even if Israel this year admitted a UN expert to visit on women's rights. I'll talk about her in a moment. And there's no positive language, not a word on the resolutions on Israel, because if your goal is to demonize, to portray as a devil, as pure evil, then something that is pure evil, you cannot say one good word about it. And that's what's happening at the United Nations highest human rights body. There's a campaign to demonize and delegitimize the Jewish state, and that is why in these resolutions, these 73 resolutions, you'll not find one positive word about Israel. And it's not just the Human Rights Council, it's also in other bodies. The UN Women's Rights Commission, known as the Commission on the Status of Women, they meet once a year every March, and they adopt only one resolution on countries, only one. And I'm sure you're wondering, is it on Iran, where women's rights are trampled, where they're forced to wear a hijab from the age of 7 to the rest of their lives, against their will? And I'm not against if women want to wear the hijab, it's their right, but they shouldn't be forced. And my friend Masih Alinejad, a women's rights activist from Iran, she says let every woman do what they want, but they should not be forced and arrested on the streets because they are breaking modesty laws. That is a violation of women's rights. And we'll come back to her and what she stands for in a moment. But at the Women's Rights Commission every year, they only condemn one country, and it's not Iran. And you may ask, is it Saudi Arabia, where women cannot drive a car, where women cannot go anywhere without the permission of a male guardian? No. The only country that gets condemned at the Women's Rights Commission is Israel. For violating the rights of Palestinian women, according to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And there was an expert, I mentioned Israel allowed in an expert to visit. She visited the expert on violence against women of the UN, and she came in Geneva a few months ago, and I was there, and she said, there's a clear linkage between Israeli occupation, as she said, and Palestinian violence against women. And I said, Madam expert, are you saying that when Palestinian men beat their wives, it's Israel's fault? When Palestinian men beat their wives, it's Israel's fault. That's what the United Nations has been saying for at least a decade. And she had no answer. And it's absurd. And I said, Madam, why in your report did you not quote the imams who are put on Palestinian television and who say that the Quran teaches you, here's how the Quran teaches you how you're supposed to beat women, how you're not supposed to beat women, here how you are supposed to beat women, here's how. She didn't quote any of that in her report. It's only somehow to blame Israel. That's what's happening at the Commission on Women's Rights. And by the way, who sits on this commission? Well, as you may have learned in April, because we revealed it, because no one else revealed it, but the United Nations Economic and Social Council, 54 countries, including Sweden, one of the members of this body, they voted, 47 out of 54 countries, to elect Saudi Arabia to the Women's Rights Commission. Yes, Saudi Arabia was elected to the Women's Rights Commission. And when we revealed it, and we revealed that only 7 countries in the world didn't vote for it, but there were 12 EU countries, including Sweden and Norway and Ireland and France. And we asked which of these countries voted for Saudi Arabia. At least 5, secret ballots, so we don't know who, but at least 5 EU countries voted for Saudi Arabia, and probably more, maybe 10. And we asked, and it was a big controversy here in Sweden, and I applaud the Swedish members of parliament who took up this issue and asked why their own country was failing to stand up for women's rights. A country which on its website and in its public materials says it's the first feminist foreign policy in the world. And the Swedish foreign minister, Margot Wallström, she said it's not important, this vote, it doesn't matter, it's not important. And then when she was pressed again, she said, and I want to quote because I don't want to get it wrong, she was asked about it, and she said, and I quote, Margot Wallström, if there is one place where they, Saudi Arabia, ought to be to learn something about women, it is in the Commission on the Status of Women. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am not from Sweden, but is it your policy that when you have a serial murderer, that you put him or her as your chief justice, as your chief of police? Is that the logic today? That the country, the worst country in the world in women's rights, they're the ones who most belong on the Commission on the Status of Women, because that's where they'll learn about women's rights? Maybe they should learn a little bit first and then decide for the world how to define and protect women's rights. And ladies and gentlemen, although we're about to mark the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which recognized the indigenous rights of the Jewish people to their historic homeland, twice a year at least, if not 3 times a year, the United Nations body for heritage, for cultural heritage, UNESCO, meets in Paris and in other cities, and at least twice a year they enact resolutions that call into question, that deny, dismiss, or downplay the connection of the Jewish people to their most holy sites, to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, holy to Jews and Christians, to the Western Wall, and most recently to Hebron, the revered site, burial place of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, and they vote and call this a Palestinian heritage site. They pass absurd resolutions. And sadly, in May, when the other countries, finally France and the others, stopped voting yes, the only European Union country in the world to vote yes to this absurd resolution in May was Sweden. And I'm very, very sad about that. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time for a change. I think that those of us who truly care about the founding principles of the United Nations, which are pure principles, which are the true ideals of peace and security, of human rights for all, of equality, those of us who truly believe in those principles enshrined in the UN Charter, articulated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we need to speak out. I put it to you that those who call themselves friends of the UN, but who do dirty deals with the automatic majority, which includes 56 Islamic states, which are committed to singling out Israel unfairly, disproportionately. And when they do deals, did you know that the United Nations works according to vote trading? I vote for you and you vote for me. The Islamic states told Russia, if you vote for us against Israel, we will vote for you. And so when there was a resolution 17 years ago on Chechnya, when Russia was bombing tens of thousands of Chechens who are Muslims, and there was a resolution about this to speak out for the Muslim victims, not one Muslim country at the Human Rights Commission voted for the resolution. Why? Because they do deals. And they did a deal with Russia. And the deal was, you vote for us and we vote for you. And that's how it works at the United Nations. And so Israel can offer one vote, and the Islamic group can offer 56 votes. And they are very forceful in this. And so it always takes courage to defend and stand up for what's right, to stand up for Israel. You know, as I said at the United Nations, if you stand up for what's right, you're standing up against 56-1. But we're calling on Sweden and other countries to do the right thing. We're calling on countries to recognize that when you stand up for the Jewish people, it always takes moral courage. According to the Anti-Defamation League, in a poll from 3 years ago, the amount of anti-Semitism in the world, they estimated 1.1 billion adults, according to their survey. They interviewed 50,000 people in 102 countries. 1.1 billion people have deep anti-Semitic views. And there are only 15 million Jews in the world, maybe 10 million adults. Basically, for every Jew in the world, you have 100 anti-Semites. For every Jew in the world, you have 100 anti-Semites. It will always take moral courage to stand up against those who persecute the Jews. Raoul Wallenberg, and we're here in Raoul Wallenberg Square, he understood that. He had the moral courage. And I'm calling on Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström and other countries to show moral courage at the United Nations. Those who truly care about the United Nations have to stand up for principles and speak out. And that's why 2 weeks from now, my organization, UN Watch, will be honoring Dr. Andres Romer, the former ambassador of Mexico to UNESCO. Because 1 year ago, when they were adopting one of these resolutions on Jerusalem to deny the connection of the Jewish people to their holiest sites, he refused to obey instructions. He refused to obey instructions. Mexico City said, you must vote with the Arab resolution, which was one-sided, biased, and denying cultural heritage. And he refused. And he walked out. And he knew what he was doing when he walked out. And within days, he was fired. But Dr. Andres Romer of Mexico is a hero. He is a hero because he was defending the true principles of UNESCO, which was founded after the Holocaust and was supposed to instill the spirit of humanity in the hearts of man. And that's why we'll be honoring him in 2 weeks with our Eleanor Roosevelt Human Rights Prize. And so I'm calling on all European countries to resist the temptation of vote trading. And I know that it promises a great career. I know if you're a Swedish foreign minister, Jan Eliasson, he's now a high official in Sweden. And unfortunately, you have to make deals to get these jobs. And I'm calling on people to think about principles first. And I wonder, if Raoul Wallenberg were alive today and he saw the Swedish government rushing to the genocidal regime of Iran, the genocidal regime because they've helped kill 500,000 people in Syria. They are the most strongest backer has troops on the ground helping Assad, and they are calling for genocide against Israel. And I saw the government of Sweden rushing to do business deals, lucrative trade deals with Iran, and I saw all the cabinet ministers the women wearing hijabs as they paraded in front what I called on Twitter the Walk of Shame, and it was covered in your newspapers. The Walk of Shame. And again, everyone can, it's not about respecting another religion. In Iran, this is an obligatory law. Every woman must wear the hijab, and women's rights activist from Iran, Masih Alinejad, who has 1 million followers, who says if you can wear what you want, but she urged European politicians, the female politicians, don't go to Iran and endorse and legitimize this anti-women law, this law that denies our basic human rights. Don't do it. And they're not listening. And they're not listening. We just saw Federica Mogherini, the foreign minister, the high commissioner of the European Union, do the same thing. And I wonder what Raoul Wallenberg would say if he saw his Swedish government rushing to do business with this genocidal regime and selling out women's rights. Now, I also call upon the European Union countries, those who abstain at UNESCO, to remember what Elie Wiesel said. You have to take sides. It's not just about abstaining. It's about humanity, not neutrality. Those who are silent are only helping the oppressor, not the victim. Finally, before I conclude, I want to pay tribute to the European co-chair of UN Watch, one of our founders, one of the great Swedes of our time, great Swedish writer, intellectual, former Deputy Prime Minister, Per Ahlmark. He's not here today because he's not well. For those of you who know him, he used to come to Geneva and he would speak out on everything that I said today. And he would say to me, Hillel, I'm warning you, I'm going to speak at the United Nations, but I'm going to say the truth. And my words will be sharp. And I said, Per, please do so. And he would speak the truth. And he spoke out against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and anti-Americanism. And he spoke out for freedom, for human rights, for democracy, against dictatorships. And for me to be in Sweden, I want to pay tribute to, as I said, Raoul Wallenberg from a long time ago, and today to Per Ahlmark. And finally, I want to conclude that we're here today to say that we are not neutral when the choice is between a liberal democracy, Israel, and a terrorist group, Hamas. We are not neutral. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel because we stand with democracy. If you believe in an independent judiciary, to have judges and the rule of law, you stand with Israel. You don't stand with Hamas. If you believe in women's rights, you stand with Israel. You don't stand with Hamas and Iran and Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Middle East, where women's rights are treated like garbage. And if you stand for freedom of speech, and if you stand for freedom of press, and if you stand for freedom of religion, and if you stand for equality, and if you stand for non-discrimination, you stand with Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, Israel is not perfect, but in today's world, in the Middle East, with everything that we're seeing, it's time for us to take a stand. And today, let us be clear, let our voices be loud and clear, that on this day, on Raoul Wallenberg Day in Stockholm, in Raoul Wallenberg Square, we stand with Israel. Thank you very much.